struggling for the surface. As he came up for air, the attorney, along with the wreckage of one of the rooms of his house, was carried down to the beach and out into the Gulf by the raging waters of the storm, before finally being brought back by those same waters and deposited on the shore. Clarence, though, could not take any joy from this, as he had just lost everything. The storm had taken his family from him, and he would never see them again. Meanwhile, Judson Palmer, the secretary of Galveston's YMCA, had, much like Isaac Klein and so many others, insisted on staying in his home, a decision he made over the objections of his wife May, who had ever since the flooding first started wanted to take their son Lee and shelter downtown in the safety of the YMCA while away from the beach. Now, in Judson's defense, much like Isaac's, his home was sturdier than most. Indeed, throughout the afternoon, a number of their neighbors and various other individuals who lived nearby came seeking shelter in the Palmers' home. Some 14 people in all had shown up, including the Bokers and their 2 children and the Burnetts and their 2 children. Judson even opened his doors for an unnamed African-American man and his wife. By 6 p.m., as the water continued to rise, the men who had taken shelter in the Palmer home helped Judson roll up the carpets on his first floor, so they and the other furniture could be hauled upstairs. The rising water, though, was just one of their worries, as the wind had already taken the slate shingles off the roof, and at 7 a gust actually blew the house's front door out of its frame. This same wind was also likely responsible for the large plate glass window in the front of the house exploding into shards of glass. As rain began pouring in and plaster from the ceiling fell, the people sheltering inside the home then tried seeking safety in the rear of the structure, only to find that the window there had also been shattered. Soon, even the second floor was flooding as the water just kept rising. Judson Palmer, his wife May, their son Lee, and another family of 4 then all sought shelter in the second floor bathroom. As they did, winds with a speed possibly as high as 150 miles an hour also began whipping through the blasted-out windows into the battered house. The stress of the water and the powerful wind soon proved to be too much for the Palmer home, as despite the confidence of everyone inside, the entire front of the structure was ripped away, leaving one family, a husband, a wife, and 2 children, standing in the middle of the front bedroom holding onto one another as the house disintegrated around them. As this was happening in the bathroom, Judson and his wife May were climbing onto the lip of their bathtub, clutching onto the shower rod with one hand and holding onto each other and their son with the other. The entire house then shifted as it was lifted off its elevated foundation. As this happened, the structure was carried into deeper waters, which brought the water level up to Judson's neck as he struggled to keep his son's head above the water. With his entire focus on this task, Judson did not notice the roof of his sturdy home falling down upon his family. All 3 then went underwater together, but when Judson breached the surface again, he found himself all alone, unable to find his wife or his son in the darkness and the rolling waters around him. Desperately, Judson started calling out for his loved ones, but like Clarence Houth, he would never see them alive again. Instead, the secretary of the city's YMCA would find himself atop a shed that was tossed about mercilessly by the storm for the next 3 hours. As for Dr. Samuel Young of the Cotton Exchange, he at least didn't have to worry about his family's safety, as he had warned them not to return home to Galveston until he sent word to them that it was safe. Dr. Young, though, increasingly became concerned about his own safety as he felt the floor beneath his feet vibrate due to his furniture on the first floor crashing against the ceiling. As this unnerving sensation continued, Dr. Young gazed out at the seascape that now surrounded his home, a view that was complete with crashing waves and few if any houses in sight. As he beheld this eerie scene, a post tore loose from his own house and struck Dr. Young in the head, a blow that would have knocked him off his feet if not for the powerful wind that pressed his back against the wall instead. It soon became too much for the house to withstand, as the entire structure began to shudder before it was finally torn away from its foundation. As it started to float free, the house began to bob and float in the water. As he felt this happening, Dr. Young ripped a door that had already been mostly torn off its hinges by the wind, free of its frame. Now, with the door in hand, Dr. Young dove into the sea, pushing himself away from the shifting structure that had once been his home. Doing so just in time as, quote, "The house rose out of the water several feet, was caught by the wind and whisked away like a railway train, and I was left in perfect security, free from all floating timber or debris, to follow more slowly." Dr. Young wasn't sure exactly where he went from here, as he and the door he clung to were carried by the current further into the city. This was because there were no landmarks anywhere he looked to help orient himself. All he could see was darkness. There were no lights, no people, only destruction. Only later Dr. Young would realize that he finally came to rest some 15 blocks away from where his house once stood. Isaac Klein's home, meanwhile, had also managed to stand strong through much of the storm, as it provided safety for some 50 men, women, and children. It had, after all, been built to withstand just about anything imaginable. The problem was, this storm was far beyond what anyone imagined. As it turns out, though, Isaac's house was not taken down by just the wind and the waves, as, unbeknownst to anyone, the storm had managed to construct a several-mile-long, 3-story-tall dam-like structure out of the various wreckage and debris it created. Pieces of homes combined with buggies, pianos, outhouses, and all manner of debris to form a massive structure that, for a time, even kept the storm-surge and waves at bay, so that the water around where Isaac's house stood was eerily calm for a time. Yet even this gigantic barrier could not resist the power of the hurricane for long, as it was consistently being pushed forward deeper into the city, destroying everything in its path as it did so. Leading the way before this Frankenstein-together structure was the streetcar trestle that had been built out into the Gulf so passengers could take a ride out over the waves. It was this structure, then, that ultimately forced the Klein home off its foundation, as, without warning, the streetcar trestle crashed into the house, ripping it off its foundation and causing it to capsize once there was no longer anything holding it upright. As the entire house started to shudder and list from this massive unexpected blow, Isaac's brother Joseph was standing by Isaac's 2 oldest daughters, Allie Mae and Rosemary. Sensing that the house was about to topple over, almost without thinking, Joseph took both girls by the hand as he launched himself backward through the window they were standing beside. In doing so, he ensured they would not be trapped inside the structure that was actively flipping over onto its side. Indeed, once they were through the window, Joseph and his nieces found themselves sitting atop the side of their toppled-over house. Joseph then, hoping to help the others who had been inside, crawled over to the window, where he called out while dangling his legs down, hoping that anyone still trapped inside might hear his voice and then seize a hold of his proffered appendage so that he could fish them out. Yet no one came. Isaac, meanwhile, had been in the middle of the room with his pregnant wife and their daughter Esther when their home was struck. As the structure began to topple over, everything fell around Isaac, and he himself was thrown into the water where he was trapped by heavy timbers. The head of Galveston's Weather Bureau then passed out, believing that he breathed his last breath. Yet the next thing he knew, Isaac was on the surface being pelted by rain, as he was still held between the same timbers, as they had apparently carried him to the surface. Isaac then was still alive, but he was now adrift in the water surrounded by wreckage and all alone. In the flashes of lightning, though, Isaac soon caught sight of a child. Not knowing who this was, Isaac still swam frantically to their side, finally realizing it was his youngest daughter, 6-year-old Esther, only after he had wrapped his arms protectively around her. Isaac then looked for his wife, who he had also been standing near when the house toppled over, but no matter where he looked, she was nowhere in sight. Isaac was then left to struggle alone to keep himself and his youngest child above water. After some time, though, he would catch sight of 3 figures holding onto some nearby wreckage. Not knowing who they might be, Isaac called out asking who they were, only to hear in response the voice of one of his young daughters asking him the same question. With this, Isaac was reunited with his brother and his other 2 daughters. The 2 brothers then did what they could to place their bodies between the blowing wind and the young children, protecting them as much as they could from the wind and the various pieces of dangerous debris it carried, which they did all the while being forced to crawl from one piece of floating wreckage to the next in their efforts to stay afloat, during which time they were repeatedly tossed astray by the wind. But each time they managed to crawl back to continue their efforts to keep the children safe. This carried on throughout the night, and at one point the wreckage they were riding on actually drifted out to sea before the wind shifted and blew them back over the island. Their terrifying journey then finally came to an end just 4 blocks away from where their house had once stood, as they climbed off the wreckage and climbed inside of a house that was somehow still standing. Joseph, Isaac, and his 3 daughters then had all survived. Isaac's pregnant wife, though, had perished likely when their house had capsized. Joseph's loyal dog would also likely die in the storm, despite at one point actually finding the family's makeshift raft. When this happened, the dog approached each member of the family, sniffing them. In doing so, it potentially realized that the children's mother was missing, and so the dog leapt off the raft potentially to search for its missing person, only to never be seen again. Also cast adrift in the waters of the now completely submerged island of Galveston was the family of Anthony Credo. Upon returning home earlier that afternoon, Anthony had intended to leave their home and take his family someplace safer. Before they could go, though, Mrs. Goldman, their neighbor, and her son arrived hoping to shelter there, as she did not trust her own home. The Credos, being good neighbors, then gave Mrs. Goldman some hot coffee as they got both her and her son into dry clothes. Yet in doing so, they missed their own opportunity to escape, as when Anthony next looked outside, he decided that it was too dangerous to leave. As the storm grew worse that day, the Credos, like others in the city, moved progressively higher and higher in their home, as the waters continued to improbably rise, until they finally climbed completely out of the house through the dormer windows in the attic. As they did so, though, the Goldmans refused to join them, a choice that likely doomed them when the structure, like so many others, was finally lifted off its foundation. As for the Credos, they were scattered and forced to clutch onto various pieces of wood to keep themselves afloat as their home toppled over. Anthony, though, fought through the waves that kept trying to scatter his family as he managed to keep them all together. Time and again, one or more of his family would be sent adrift in the wrong direction, but Anthony would retrieve them. Even his constant vigilance, though, was not enough, as Raymond, his young son, would be smashed against a telephone pole that cut a deep gash into his scalp. Seeing this, Anthony gathered the injured boy into his arms, keeping the two of them afloat even as he kept an eye on the rest of his family. Finally, the Credos came across an inverted roof which Anthony ordered everyone to climb onto. Yet, despite his own creeping exhaustion, Anthony did not join his family on the roof as he refused to risk his weight causing it to flip them all back into the dangerous waters. Yet, even with this precaution, the roof still began to fall apart from the destructive force of the waves. As this was happening, though, luck had it that a porch which had been ripped off a house somewhere in the city just happened to float by. Anthony then ordered his family to move onto this new lifeboat, which would prove to be so stable that some of his children actually managed to fall asleep. Their tribulations, though, were still far from over, as about an hour into their time on the porch, a wave sent a piece of timber into three of Anthony's young daughters, casting one, Victoria, over the side. Victoria would never surface. Meanwhile, another of his daughters, Pearl, would also be struck by a piece of wood, which the heavy winds actually jammed through her arm just below the elbow. As her mother then held her, Anthony removed the spike of wood from the little girl's arm, before bandaging the wound as best he could in these circumstances. In the end, Anthony and his wife managed to save their daughters, little Ruby, Vivian, and Florence. Pearl and Raymond would also successfully recover from their wounds. Still, Anthony would lose 9 relatives due to the storm. In addition to little Vivian, whose body they would recover and bury, Anthony also lost his oldest daughter Irene and her 2 children. Then there was Minnie, another of his older daughters, who had also been sheltering with her own family. She too disappeared in the storm, along with her husband and their 2 children, as did his eldest son William, who had been away visiting his fiancée at the time. The Credo story was far from unique, though. Few came through the storm without losing someone. Even fewer, though, could match the tragic tale of what took place in St. Mary's Orphanage, which was a brick and stone structure that was the home of 93 children who were in the care of 10 nuns. The structure's location on the beach just above the tide line ensured that it was quickly surrounded by the rising tide. In fact, by 10 in the morning that day, the water around the orphanage was already 3 feet deep. As night fell and the waves crashed against the building's second story, the sisters guided all the children under their care into the chapel on the second floor. Here, the 21-year-old Mother Superior, Sister Camillus, ordered all the youngest children to be tied together in groups of 6 to 8 using links of clothesline that was then to be tied to one of the sisters, with the idea being this would keep them from getting lost should they find themselves adrift in the waves. Meanwhile, the oldest children, like 13-year-olds Will Murney and Albert Campbell and 14-year-old Francis Bolnovic, would not be tied together in this manner. Such precautions took on even greater importance as the water continued to rise and batter the orphanage. Soon the boys' dormitory broke apart and fell into the ocean, at which point the nuns guided the children in their care to the girls' dormitory that was located on the side of the building away from the beach. Yet even this wasn't safe, as the water continued to plow through the orphanage, destroying the chapel in the process, before it finally found its way into the girls' dormitory, where the terrified children huddled together singing. Barely seconds passed between the water and the wind reaching the girls' dormitory before it joined the rest of the orphanage as it too fell into pieces. As it did, the lifelines that the sisters had tied to their young charges to keep them safe in this eventuality ultimately proved to be fatal. You see, the clotheslines, while keeping the children and the nuns together, also unfortunately got tied up in the numerous bits of underwater wreckage. When this happened, these lines held fast, holding all who were connected to them underwater, ensuring that none would escape. In fact, out of the 93 children in the orphanage, only the three oldest, Will, Albert, and Francis, who had not been tied to anyone else, survived. Because of this, and due to sheer